It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and here to talk about habits of a healthy marriage is Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons. Thanks for being here, Doctor.
Great being with you, Kyle.
When we're talking about marriage, what do you think is the hardest thing about being married?
Well, I think there are a number of different things. One is it doesn't get supported enough. There's not enough communication about the beauty and the power of marriage. St. John Paul II has tried to do that. We don't hear enough in our churches and our schools and friendships about how great marriage is. It's a sacred, lifelong union between a husband and a wife. Fabulous mission. Share mutual love, raise children, help kids get to heaven, help your spouse get to heaven, and radiate the love of the Trinity. That's right. Radiate the love of the Trinity. The flow of love between a husband and wife is an icon. It's an image of that love which flows from the heart of God. It's a phenomenal mission in life. People don't get it today.
Right.
The message, that great message about marriage, has not been communicated fully for about 50 years in the church. Now, St. John Paul II worked hard to do that, but his writing is incorporated into every chapter of this book, and it's essential to build up hope. We need much more hope that marital conflicts can be resolved, and they can be, and hope about the beauty of marriage. So young people, instead of cohabiting, which is a dead-end, dark place to go, and which rarely leads to fulfillment in marriage later, can forget about cohabitating and think about and be more hopeful about marriage. There's not enough hope, Kyle, about the sacrament of marriage in this culture.
Do you think that marriage is easier or harder now than it was 50 years ago?
Oh, marriage is much harder. Marriage is very, very demanding, but that's part of its beauty, that it's demanding. It demands the best for us. So by that I mean this, we have to get out of ourselves. So one of the major enemies of marriage is selfishness. This culture is steeped in selfishness. Major academic psychologists say, look, we got a generation of total narcissism, total epidemic of selfishness. So that's a huge problem. And when faith diminishes in the culture, when faith diminishes, Pope Benedict would write, faith diminishes, selfishness grows. And then what happens is the heart grows cold. Instead of thinking me of marriage, you think me. That's, in the long term, extremely harmful to the person who embraces it, as well as the spouse and the children. It's a major reason for divorce. One of the reasons for this book is to encourage people, if you really work at uncovering each weakness in the spouse, each of their weaknesses. I mean, everybody's got weaknesses. There was only one, from a Catholic perspective, one perfect family. Everybody else has baggage they bring into their marriage. Everyone. So let's figure out that baggage before you get married. There's a chapter on that, the last chapter. You don't need to see a mental health professional like me, because many of them don't do a good job at this. That's another reason for this book, is to point out, that good habits, virtues, plus faith can really bring healing to marriage. It's great risk going out there and just looking for a marriage therapist. To give you an example, in the introduction to the book, I cite a study, 600 couples by a leading American family scholar. Those who went to counseling, 2 to 3 times more divorce, Kyle, than those who didn't.
Really? Why is that?
Yeah, why? Why is that? Well, here's the reason for that. Several reasons. One is most mental health professionals embrace, I presented to you the Catholic view of marriage, but most mental health professionals embrace the psychological view of marriage. And that is this. Marriage is about me. I'm responsible for my own happiness. I'm not responsible for my spouse's happiness. So if I'm not happy, it must be my spouse's fault, and therefore I've got to consider other options. And significant numbers of mental health professionals buy that. And they do not encourage spouses to do what I mentioned earlier. Okay, what's your baggage? What's the weakness you have? So 70% of divorces are initiated by wives. Many of them have come into their marriage, not all of them, but no small number have come into their marriages with a weak foundation for marriage in their relationship with their fathers. That is, they don't have a good foundation for trust. Men have that, like the major baggage men have is more of a confidence weakness, not getting enough positive strokes from their fathers. But this baggage is critical because what the psychological science would indicate is roughly 70% of people's adult psychological conflicts, significant ones, come from unresolved issues from their youth. Now, however, selfishness is a different story. That's not something that's caused by trauma. It's caused by, like, loving oneself more than loving God or loving your spouse and children.
So how many of these weaknesses do you think we're actually aware of, and how much of it do we really need to dig deep to uncover them?
So, Kyle, that's a very good question. So most of us, for example, in the first chapter is on dealing with anger and working at forgiving. So most people they deny it. So with anger, we can deny it, we can express it, we can forgive, okay? Most of us deny it. So we don't enter our marriages knowing, oh, I've got some baggage with my father or my mother. Maybe I think of forgiving them, I'll have a better marriage. So a lot of these things are totally unconscious. So they're buried. And so one of the approaches of this book is to try to point out certain behaviors that would indicate that you have this weakness. And they're not easy to face, but if you can uncover them and think, look, there's some good habits I can grow in. If you're Catholic, there's the spiritual life, prayer, the sacraments, they can help me overcome these weaknesses. And they really can. I mean, getting back to the major one today, the other huge one today, Kyle, is trusting. The ability to trust people that has been severely damaged by the divorce plague. By the divorce plague, by hooking up, by cohabiting. I mean, human sexuality is very beautiful, but it's meant to be within the sacrament of marriage. Mm-hmm. And when it isn't, people get used as sexual objects. They lose their trust, and trust is the whole foundation for loving. This is one of the major reasons for the explosion of cohabitation. Just to give you an example of that, and what's happened, this whole retreat from marriage. 1969, in the United States, we had roughly 430,000 Catholic marriages. 1969. 2016, 140. So we have this massive retreat from marriage. A lot of that is people are afraid of marriage, or they're afraid of divorce, or they've been used repeatedly. They've been huge mistakes themselves sexually, which has really damaged their basic ability to trust people.
So I guess before finding the antidote for our weaknesses and these struggles, what's the best way to identify them in the first place? Which ones that we need help with?
Great question. So great questions. And this book has been out about 6 weeks. Kyle, the most positive feedback I've gotten about this book thus far is the last chapter. The last chapter is on just the question you raised. The last chapter is on humility, the virtue of humility. Mm-hmm. Why humility? Humility so you can look at your weaknesses and look at your father, look at your mother, a lot of probing questions. How did they relate? How did they get along? In all likelihood, you're going to repeat that. We model after our parents for good and not so good. Mm-hmm. So going in self-knowledge, and that's what the last chapter is all about, can be very, very helpful to uncover these things. My hope, Kyle, I do a lot of work with Roman Catholic priests and seminarians. My hope is that this last chapter will be incorporated into the screening process of candidates for priesthood and seminary, and incorporated, I'm working now with some family life offices, hoping that it can be incorporated more into modified, certain questions, modified in the premarital program, because there's a great freedom in facing these things, but they're hard to face. I mean, I got to be honest, I joked with my wife early in the marriage. I said, honey, you're really lucky that I've worked on my baggage for years. And he looks at me, he says, Rick, what about selfishness? She was totally right. I married later. I had not looked at that. Thought that's a weakness in my personality. It was. And I'm not unique. I mean, so the reality is all of us can give in to selfishness. So to have a really good marriage, it's really important to think about, recognizing certain weaknesses, trusting God with them. And I mean, I think I see so much trust damaged every single day in my work, Kyle, that when I leave the home in the morning, I often say a prayer with my wife, Lord, deepen our trust in you, number one. Number two, deepen our trust in each other. If many couples did that, this thought about marriage, divorce rather, which often comes from a loss of trust, that wouldn't be on the radar screen. They'd be thinking, okay, and working on anger too. If they worked at thinking, I don't want to express my anger, one of the major problems is people have this view of anger that is totally incorrect. That's, by the way, so anger is my specialty. Before this book, 2 books with the American Psychological Association, books with a colleague at the University of Wisconsin on the virtue of forgiveness, it's called positive psychology, using virtues to diminish anger. And so looking to avoid expressing anger is extremely important to protect marriages. If you can avoid expressing anger in your marriage, and here's how you do that. When you feel angry, inwardly you think, forgive, trust, forgive, trust. Well, maybe more intense. Forgive, trust, forgive. But as you work on that, what happens is, when you're done, about 4 or 5 of those, at the end, it's like, oh, forgive, trust. Oh, forgive, love. In other words, the weaknesses that a spouse has are often not enormous. And if you work at trying to forgive that spouse for his or her weakness, your anger tones down, and then you can say, oh, honey, by the way, I think you're acting a little controlling today. Huge marital problem. Honey, I think you're acting very distant today. Another huge marital problem. Honey, I think you need to be more positive in your communication. Another big marital problem. So if you can try to master your anger, that has an enormous benefit, Kyle, in protecting marriage. Because when anger is expressed, and if it's done repeatedly, people put up walls, and then your basic warm feeling towards your husband or your wife can really take a nosedive.
Well, a lot of these things, each chapter you pair off 2 things that, like an antidote for the problem. And sometimes they might be opposites, like generosity conquers selfishness. But some of them aren't intuitive to me. So are these common within your field of study, or are these kind of concepts that you came up with?
No, this is something, Kyle. This has been a long, hard work for me. So this is something when I was shortly after I finished my training at Penn here with adults and children. I learned about forgiveness. I didn't learn about it for any professor at Penn. I learned about it from going to a charismatic meeting and hearing this simple redemptorist brother say at the end of the meeting, I think we ought to think about now forgiving. Think of yourself as a child and forgive your father for this and your mother for that. And I'm sitting in the pew, and I almost fell out of the pew thinking, this is extraordinary. This is extraordinary. This is getting into the childhood pain that people have. Father, mother, 4 major areas. Mother first. That's the most important relationship. Second, father. Third, siblings, brothers, sisters. Fourth, your friendships. And this periodically, not every week, but every month maybe, he would go into like forgiving in one of those 4 areas. It was extraordinary. It opened my eyes. So then a couple of years later, I wrote the first paper in the mental health field about how to use forgiveness in psychotherapy. So I first worked on forgiveness, but then I thought, wait a minute. So that takes care of anger that comes from life hurts. But major causes of anger in marriage are not unjust life hurts, but there's sadness causes anger, anxiety causes anger, and then selfishness causes anger. So when I got to understand that more, I thought, well, wait a minute. Forgiveness does diminish anger, but it's not the last word. Because like with selfish anger that comes out of selfishness, forgiveness is okay. But getting to the root is really important, like fighting selfishness. Or people who are highly anxious, they're trusting is very important, because if your anxiety makes you irritable, sadness makes you irritable, insecurity makes you irritable. So then I have to begin to think, well, wait a second here. And this is a field called positive psychology. Basically, Kyle, it's a return to the basic principles about the human person. In Christianity, before the mental health field developed, the whole goal was you want to have a healthy personality, grow in virtues, and become more Christ-like. Because the more you grow in virtues, the more Christ-like you become. And that's fundamentally a goal in marriage, is to become another Christ to your spouse,
right,
to your husband or your wife. So if Catholic mental health professionals and other mental health professionals could get that, we wouldn't have all this divorce. We wouldn't have, the plague, I can tell you this, one of the most difficult aspects of my work is dealing with the children of divorce. With couples where they won't work on overcoming their weaknesses, because I know it's lifelong damage. The children with divorce there's virtues, there's grace to help them cope with it, but that's like being struck by lightning. That's how your core center of emotion is struck by lightning when children are subjected to the divorce of their parents.
Yeah, there's so much more to talk about, and you have an example for each one of these chapters that's really helpful. Where can people get the book?
They can get it at Ignatius Press, or the publisher, or that other source.
All right.
That I won't name.
It's called Habits for a Healthy Marriage, a handbook for Catholic couples. Thank you so much, Dr. Richard Fitzgibbons, for sharing with us. Appreciate it.